Hello, people from the future. I'm now recording this lesson, and I'm talking about the relationship between branches, and I'm talking about the executive and the legislature. So remember, my arrows here are slightly misleading. We need to look at how the executive impacts the legislature, and we need to look at how the legislature impacts the executive. That is our goal, and we're actually going to do this in two separate lessons. You know, one going one way, and one going the other. Right, there are some exam questions there that I want to talk to you about at some point, but I'll do that in a different section, especially now I'm kind of recording this one. Okay, so first of all, this lesson's going to be a little bit of a list, but I want to kind of talk you through the things on the list. But basically, there's a whole bunch of ways, if you just look at the title, there's a whole bunch of ways that Parliament can control the executive. And if I just flip across to this slide, there's a whole bunch of ways that the executive can control Parliament. Okay, so what we're going to be doing in our lessons this week is, first of all, we're going to go through the ways that Parliament can control the executive, make sure we understand them, make sure we've got an idea of how they all work, and then we're going to go through the ways that the executive can control Parliament, make sure you understand them, make sure you understand how they work, and then hopefully by Friday we can then kind of discuss which side is actually stronger. So if I then go back to my little pie chart, you will hopefully have an opinion on whether you think, you know, that way is stronger, or whether you think that way is stronger. Do you get the idea? Of course, it does change over time. This isn't necessarily a stable, fixed relationship. In fact, that might even be like your first point to kind of note down that this is a relationship which is fluid, that has definitely changed within my lifetime, definitely changed within your lifetime, that sometimes Parliament is stronger, sometimes the executive is stronger, and there are reasons for that we will be studying. So this is the list. I'm going to go through each one slowly using the images. I did have time to put together some images on the next slide, which is going to be the same list. But when I upload the PowerPoint, in fact, you know what I'll do is if I just copy this list into the, oh, there's my timetable. Brilliant. There you go. For those of you that wanted to see my timetable, there it is. I will copy the list into the chat, and then you've got that there, and you can even copy that into whatever you're note taking on, and you can take notes around it, or you can just ignore it, or whatever it is. But there it is if you want it. And I'm also going to put on some animations here so everything appears one at a time. Let's have it bounce in spectacularly, because that sounds fun. Okay, right, so here we go. So our goal is ways to discuss ways that Parliament can control the executive. All of these are going to be like, to what extent does this work? So when I'm talking about these, what I want you to be thinking in your head is, how powerful is this? How much impact does this actually have? Do I know anything that counters this? Or is this something that makes you go, damn, that's a good way that Parliament can control the executive? You know, like which way, like how good are these things? And I'll probably say already that these are unequal. I'm not going to give you like 10 great ways that Parliament can control the executive. I'm going to give you all the different ways, and then it's kind of up to us and you guys in your groups to talk through which ones you think are the strongest and the most useful, and which ones basically don't really do very much. So let's start off with the obvious nuclear option. That is James Callaghan, and as I'm sure all of you immediately went, as soon as you saw the picture, I bet everyone in the class went, bam, James Callaghan, know that one, bam. Prime Minister 1977, I think, to 1979. He was the only Prime Minister in recent memory to have his government removed by a vote of no confidence. And what that meant is that the House of Commons, as a group, voted to remove his entire government and to call a general election. And the vote of no confidence is a power that Parliament always has. Parliament, at any point, I think, can always call a vote of no confidence and can always vote out the entire government and call a general election. However, of course, this hasn't happened since 1979. So already we kind of need to be thinking, right, so this is possible, but it's very, very rare. And of course, you guys know that the government nearly always has a majority in Parliament. I mean, that's why the government is the government, because they have a majority in Parliament. So it's only going to happen if MPs in the government actually vote against the government or on the government side. So easy to put in simple circumstances right now. Boris Johnson has a majority of about 80. In order for Boris Johnson to be a victim to a vote of no confidence, about 80 Conservative MPs no, half of them. About 45 Conservative MPs would have to vote against the vote of no confidence, vote for them. About 40 MPs, Conservative MPs, would have to vote Boris out for it to work. That's what I'm saying. Their own side has to kind of vote with them. But it is important to note that it is always there. You know, if Boris went nuts tomorrow, or if you're watching this in the future, if whoever is the Prime Minister went nuts tomorrow and they needed to get the executive right away, Parliament can do it, because we have parliamentary sovereignty in our country. So when you're in your groups in about 20 minutes time, like, just have a think about that one. Is that a really strong one, or is it not a really strong one? Like, you can really argue that one both ways. Moving on. Secondly, Parliament can always vote against any legislation that the government puts in. And the reason why I put Theresa May there is because famously, when she tried to put what she called her Brexit deal through Parliament in 2018, possibly, maybe 19, Parliament voted against it quite spectacularly, voted it down. She didn't get it through. But government defeats actually happen relatively commonly, like not every day, not every week, not every month, but probably once or twice, maybe 3 times a Parliament, maybe more, depends on the government. Parliament will vote against the executive's legislation. But of course, all of the kind of issues here kind of apply here too. In order for the government to lose a vote, some government MPs realistically have to kind of vote against it. So these are kind of the 2 most powerful powers, but in some ways they're also the 2 least likely to actually occur because of the system that we have, but they are there. And if you're writing an essay on this, I would expect both of them to be there. Even if you dismiss them, you know, even if you kind of say, look, these powers are here, but actually I don't like them, I want them to be there. But at the same time, you can build these up, because you can easily write an essay that says, yeah, but ultimately Parliament has the power to kick out whoever they want. You know, it's there. It's up to you how you want to argue that, or what you personally believe. Now I'm going to go into some more kind of technical bits about Parliament. You should already know about select committees and bill committees, and you should already know about the Liaison Committee, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But what I want to talk to you briefly about now is the Backbench Business Committee, and this is relatively new in terms of Parliament, and I'll talk more about this one in our next lesson. But normally the government gets to choose what you talk about in Parliament. Like, the government calls what's called the timetable or the agenda. They choose what's debated on and voted on every single day. But the Backbench Business Committee has a whole load of backbenchers on it, including this guy. And you should know what a backbencher is, someone that's not a member of the government. And they can choose the parliamentary timetable for 35 days a year, 35 parliamentary days a year. You probably want to jot that number down. So let me put that in a short little sentence for you. This means that for 35 days a year, backbenchers choose what they discuss in Parliament, not the executive. I'll pause there. Now, is this a big power? Is this a small power? Well, it's big because it means that if they want something debated in Parliament, if they want something voted on in Parliament, they now have the opportunity to do so, to set the timetable, to actually get this stuff discussed in Parliament. But this is not the same as actually being able to change the law or bring the government down. It's more like an opportunity to have a debate. It's an opportunity to have a professional discussion, an opportunity to get some sort of kind of media attention. But if I was to say to you before this lesson, how many of you heard of the Backbench Business Committee, or how many of you have heard of what's called opposition days? Probably none of you, unless you've done some kind of wider reading, in which case you're awesome. But it does mean, for example, that the Labour Party, who's not in power, gets to choose what is discussed and voted on like 10, 15 times a year, which is quite a useful power for them to kind of bring attention to something that they might want to. So that's the Backbench Business Committee, an opportunity to choose what is discussed on in Parliament. Now, these we've discussed before, the select committees. The select committees, just as a quick reminder, are small groups of MPs, about 20 odd, I think it is, that have a specific department that they investigate, education, health, defence, etc., etc., and they will scrutinise the government's actions, what they are doing. They will interview MPs, ministers, pressure groups, witnesses, and they will continue to investigate and pass judgments on what the government is doing, and to make reports and recommendations on their behalf. So it's a small group of MPs. that investigates departments and makes recommendations. But of course, the government is not obliged to take on any of their recommendations, i.e. the select committee can say, we think you should do X, and the government says, I'm not going to do it. On the other hand, it is a way again of bringing publicity to something, to ask awkward questions, to actually get a minister sat in front of you and actually ask them questions about what they're doing, which is quite a powerful tool. Imagine you were doing something naughty, whatever it might be, something wrong, something illegal. Just the act of someone being able to make you sit in front of you and ask you questions is actually quite powerful, because the act of being able to question you publicly means you have to answer those questions, and then you have options. You either got to lie, or you've got to kind of talk your way out of it. But questioning is a powerful tool. It's not as powerful as being able to block, for sure. And so this is definitely one you can argue this way or that way. But questioning in general is a lot of the ways that Parliament controls the executive. Now, the reason why I put this gentleman here is this is a gentleman called Julian Lewis. And one thing I didn't put on this particular PowerPoint, but is on the ones that I copied into the chat, is select committees now have elected heads, meaning that MPs vote for who they want to be the head of each select committee. And the idea here is that that makes the heads of those select committees independent of the government, not voted for by the government, and is more likely to kind of hold the government to account. Now, do any of you guys remember failing Chris Grayling? We talked about him in individual ministerial responsibility. Chris Grayling has been like our kind of case study of a minister who isn't very good. And he was the guy that bought a load of shit. Who gave a shipping contract to a company that didn't have any ships. Although I seem to remember that some of you thought they didn't matter because they could just buy some ships. But I can still come back to my original point that they don't have any ships. Okay, so Boris Johnson last year tried to put Chris Grayling as the head of, I think it was the Defence Select Committee. So I'll say that again. Boris Johnson tried to put Chris Grayling as the head of the Defence Select Committee, and because he thought he would be like a friendly person to be the head of the committee. And the committee turned around, and behind Chris Grayling's back, they voted in Julian Lewis instead. Julian Lewis is a Conservative MP, but he's not necessarily as friendly with Boris as Chris Grayling was. But the point here is the select committee, the MPs deliberately put in an independent head of that committee, Julian Lewis, rather than a kind of a government plant, Chris Grayling. Might be worth you guys, especially those of you that are stretching high, Google that story. I'm sure you'd find something about it. Quick article to kind of read through. Just put in like Julian Lewis, Chris Grayling, Select Committee, and I'm sure you'll find the story. It's a good one. It's a good one because it shows Parliament deliberately being independent and trying to kind of pull away. Now, if you remember this, the Liaison Committee. We've talked about this before, but the Liaison Committee is a bit like a Select Committee, except a few times a year, it actually gets to interview the Prime Minister himself or herself. And the picture you can see there is Boris Johnson being interviewed by the Liaison Committee from, I think it must have been towards the end of last year somewhere. Obviously, it's on Zoom because of lockdown, but he is there. And here you can see all the members of the Select Committee, and they are able to put their questions to him. I read a really interesting report about liaison committees a few weeks ago for part of my degree, and it was it's really interesting how they've kind of evolved over time. They have slowly become more precise at asking questions and using this ability to question the Prime Minister quite effectively. But there's no actual obligation for the Prime Minister to appear. So whilst the Prime Minister kind of has to turn up for Prime Minister's questions, the Prime Minister doesn't actually have to turn up to the Liaison Committee. It's always voluntary. And Boris has been pretty conspicuous by his absence. I think I might have mentioned this to you when we looked at them before, is that he's supposed, and I'm definitely putting that in quotes, he's supposed to appear before it, I think it's 3 times a year. He's kind of running on about once at the moment, and even that is kind of like after lots of reminders and a nice card and some invites involving chocolate. He really doesn't want to go because he doesn't like the scrutiny, and Boris doesn't like questioning him. and probably being questioned during Corona is probably not a very pleasant experience. So I'm not criticising Boris for that, but I am pointing out that he is able to just not turn up, which is perhaps one of the weaknesses of the Liaison Committee. Does anyone have any questions so far? If you do, you can just type it in the chat, or you can interrupt me. Okay, just over halfway there, I think. New conventions. What is a convention? Remember, a convention is a tradition which has kind of gone on for so long that it's kind of become a rule, and you kind of have to follow it unless you don't want to follow it anymore, in which case you don't have to follow it. You know, it's that kind of awkward thing that it's like a rule, but at the same time, it's not a legal rule. You know, it's not a law, it's a tradition. There are now a few new conventions in Parliament that has actually increased the power of Parliament. One of them is that Parliament now gets to vote whenever military action takes place. Okay, I'll say that again. There is a new convention that Parliament gets a vote whenever military action takes place. And this, I believe, was started under David Cameron, I think. It might be Gordon Brown. Let me double check that one. But basically, since the Iraq War, when incidentally there was a vote, Britain has been a bit more cagey about military action. And so it's been kind of become a tradition now that the government has to seek the permission of Parliament to do military action. Now, of course, remember, going back to that word, it's a convention, not a rule. And there have been, Theresa May actually did do some military action without parliamentary approval. So conventions can be broken. The picture there is a man called Hilary Benn, who's Tony Benn's son, if you know anything about 1980s history, Labour. And what he's doing in that photo is he's giving a very passionate speech about why he thinks Britain should intervene in Syria, which currently has a civil war. And basically Parliament was having this debate. They were about to vote on whether Britain should get involved in Syria. And interestingly, if you look behind Hilary Benn, you'll see Mr. Jeremy Corbyn. You see him there? And you see him looking thoroughly grumpy? He is looking thoroughly grumpy, and he is grumpy because Jeremy Corbyn didn't want military action in Syria. And he just stood up and given a speech why we shouldn't intervene. And then Hilary Benn just stood up on the same side, the same party, and gave a speech why we should intervene. And it was a brilliant speech. Like, if you ever want to watch a speech that makes you kind of go, man, I agree with everything you say. It was one of them. You know, it was a good speech, a bit like Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" or Mark Antony's "Friends, Roman Countrymen." You know, it was just a really good quality speech. But it was an example of when Parliament got to vote over military action, and in that particular case, they did vote to intervene in Syria. There has also been an occasion where Parliament voted no to military action, and the government didn't do it. That happened under David Cameron. It was David Cameron and Barack Obama. Do you remember him? Barack Obama wanted to intervene in a country called Libya, and Barack Obama kind of went to David Cameron, was like, "Hey Dave, how about me and you, old time's sake, Middle East, America, US, England together? Let's go bomb the Middle East. It'll be fun." David Cameron was like, "Sure. Although by convention, just got to send it through Parliament just to make sure it's all right." Barack was like, "Sure. David Cameron sends it through Parliament, and to everyone's shock, really, Parliament votes no, and David Cameron has to go back to Barack Obama and say, "My bad. I can't join you on this one." And Obama was not pleased. He was not pleased at all. The other new convention that's worth mentioning here is that Parliament now gets to vote on treaties as well. They get to vote on whether, if we say we made a treaty with the EU, there was news on the other day that Parliament's seeking to make a new treaty to get us into the Asia-Pacific Treaty Organization. There is now a convention that Parliament gets a vote on this as well. The Fixed Term Parliaments Act. I really like this one as a discussion because it's a really, really good one. But the Fixed Term Parliament Act we looked at before. It's now that there is now a general election that's called every 5 years. It used to be a prerogative power of the Prime Minister, i.e. the Prime Minister used to call general elections whenever he or she felt it was beneficial to them. The Fixed Term Parliament Act took that away. So we're thinking about what the title is here. Ways Parliament can control the executive. Now, if the Prime Minister wants to call a general election, they can't just do it. And if they do want to just do it, they have to go to Parliament and say, I want a general election. Theresa May in 2017 went to Parliament and said, I want a general election, and Parliament voted yes. Boris went to Parliament in 2019 and said, I want a general election, and Parliament said no. Boris then changed a few things about Brexit, and then he went back to Parliament and said, I want a general election, and Parliament said yes. But the point is, Boris had to respect Parliament, and he had to change what he was doing in terms of Brexit before we do it. If you'd like me to explain that in more detail, just get in touch and have a chat with me, and I can talk about it more. But the point is here, Parliament now chooses when the elections come, not the Prime Minister. Questioning. John Bercow. I'm sure all of you have seen Prime Minister's questions. We've talked about it. So Parliament spends a lot of its time questioning, and this is one of its key ways to control the executive, whether it's select committees, as I've already mentioned, liaison committees, but there's a couple of others I'd like to mention. The first one is Prime Minister's questions, blah, 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 blah. But the second one is something called urgent questions, which I do think I've mentioned before, but it's an important one. An urgent question is where something happens. So say this thing that just happened with Northern Ireland and the EU, or what's going on this morning. There's some big thing about Burma. Did you guys see that there's been a military coup in Burma? I think it is. Or even Captain Tom in hospital. Let's say something major happens, and someone wants to get a government reaction. And what they do is they go to the Speaker, and I put John Bercow here because John Bercow was Speaker when this power was kind of really used for the first time. They go to the Speaker and they say, I want to ask the government about whatever it is, the situation in Burma, the EU deal, whatever it is. And then the Speaker makes a choice about this urgent question. Will the government have to answer this urgent question? And if the Speaker decides yes, the government must send a representative to answer questions in the House. Often that would be a minister or the Prime Minister, but it could be a junior minister. It doesn't necessarily have to be the cabinet minister. And if I just show you this slide here, this is the number of urgent questions that have been asked per year. And you can see, looking here, that urgent questions are basically never really used. Although they potentially exist, they're never really used. Like, it literally hit zero in 2004, 2005, and same here in 2008. And then one of the reasons why John Bercow is so controversial, John Bercow comes in here in about 2009. So this is basically the start of the John Bercow era. And you can see that he starts allowing them hugely. You know, we go up to 80 here, we go up to kind of like 50 or so here. But the point is, this isn't just 50, this is 50 or so per year. 50 times per year, the government is summoned to Parliament to answer an urgent question. And then look at Brexit. Look at this. As soon as you hit Brexit, whoa, we're up here at like 260 urgent questions in a year. That's like 3 a week. So urgent questions have become one of the ways that Parliament can hold the government to account, forcing them to appear in Parliament to answer questions on a certain topic. So under questioning, you should have jotted down Prime Minister's questions and urgent questions, and you might want to draw a little line back to select committees, liaison committees, and any other types of questioning we've got. Two more. House of Lords. Don't forget the House of Lords. House of Lords is part. I've gone all Cockney there for a minute. House of Lords is part of Parliament, yeah. The House of Lords is part of Parliament, and even though the government finds it very easy to control the House of Commons, sometimes, they find it far harder to control the House of Lords because they don't have an inbuilt majority in it. And the House of Lords can block and delay for over a year. You probably remember that ping pong ping thing from before Christmas. The House of Lords is an important way that Parliament can slow down, block, cause the government to think again, etc., etc. I'm not going to extend that explanation other than saying that you really should know that case study of the Internal Markets Bill. The House of Lords gets in government's way. And lastly, this is a tricky one to understand and explain, but I think it's an important one, which is that over the last 20, 30 years, there has simply been a cultural shift within Parliament to be less, the word here is differential to Parliament. So culturally, especially during the Thatcher era, Parliament very much did not try to control the executive. And you can see it in those urgent questions. You know, on the slide I just kind of showed you there, that there was kind of a feeling amongst MPs that Parliament would just kind of let the executive do things. Yes, of course, from time to time there is a vote of no confidence. Yes, of course, from time to time there is a vote against Parliament. I'm not discounting any of those things. But what I am saying is that over the last 20 or 30 years, there has been a cultural shift that more of these powers should be used. And if you notice from most of the examples I've given today, I have been saying over the last 10 years, over the last 5 years, recently this, recently that. And a lot of that shows that there aren't necessarily new powers for Parliament, but there has been a cultural shift that they are more likely to use them. They are more likely to block a fixed term, to block an election, more likely to stop military action, more likely to ask good questions in the Liaison Committee, etc., etc., etc. Why has the cultural shift happened? Maybe something to do with a long period of New Labour power, maybe something to do with a coalition government fragmenting traditional kind of party loyalties. Maybe Brexit has very much kind of pulled parties in different directions. The man there, who I hope some of you recognise, is Dominic Grieve. He's your old MP, and he very much disagreed with Theresa May's Brexit deal and Boris's Brexit deal, and he voted against it, argued against it, campaigned against it. You know, just culturally, and he was a Conservative MP. Was a Conservative MP. He was very happy to stand up and go against what had been there before. So there you go. I will end the little lecture section of my lesson here. So I'm going to end the recording and I will carry on speaking to the class. But these are ways Parliament can control the executive. All of them have counter arguments. All of them are to the extent, and in our next lecture we'll be looking at ways the executive can control Parliament. But for now I will end the lecture section there. Stop recording. Stop.